Good afternoon. Please have a seat. We'd like to get started. My name is Viet Nguyen. I'm a professor at UC Davis and an adjunct research fellow at PPIC. I work in the area of corrections at PPIC, and I want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institute, a think tank. We have offices in San Francisco and here in Sacramento. For today's program, we'll hear the main findings from a new report titled California Probation in the Era of Reform, authored by Viet Nguyen, who will give the presentation, Mia Bird, and myself. You should have received a copy of the report at the registration table. The full report, along with the slides from today's presentation, are actually available on the PPIC website. That's ppic.org. After the Viet's presentations, we should have plenty of time for audience Q&A. A couple more kind of housekeeping things before we get started. Later today, you're going to receive via email a short survey that asks you to let us know how we did. And if you have not done so already, please silence your cell phone. I'm going to start by giving a couple of broad comments that relate to the larger context of the presentation we're going to see today. California is undoubtedly in the midst of a period of rapid change in its correctional policy, and it spans at least the last decade. I think there's kind of two key dimensions to these changes. One is a lessening of the reliance on the state prison system, and the second is an expansion of the role of counties in managing felony offenders. This grand policy experiment really calls out for research to discern what its impacts have been, but also to help us with efforts to improve performance in ways that protect the public and save money. Fortunately, these changes are occurring really at an all-time high in terms of the interest in using data and evidence in informing policy at both the state and the local and the county level. Now, the research you're going to hear about today is part of an ongoing data collection project between PPIC, the Board of State and Community Corrections, Department of Justice, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and 12 California counties. And these counties make up 2/3 of the state's population. The project involves working with our partner counties and state agencies to build a data system that will enable PPIC and others to investigate the impacts of reforms, some that have happened in the past and those that will happen in the future, to chart the ways that the population under correctional control are changing, and to evaluate the impacts of very specific kinds of interventions to try and identify services and strategies that reduce recidivism. To date, we have published reports on the impact of Prop 47 on jail use. A piece came out in the spring on the use of pretrial release in the state. And last year, a companion piece to the piece Viet will now present on was on the topic of California jail populations under the era of reform. And that covers the period of both realignment and Prop 47. And I encourage you to visit our website to access this work if you're interested. Now we want to start with a kind of an acknowledgement of our partners in this effort. First of all, the research is supported with financially, in part with funds from the National Institute of Justice. And we couldn't really do this work without the support of the probation departments in the case of this report, but also the staff in those agencies as well as the sheriff's agencies who provide us with the data and sit through long conference calls trying to make sense of what it all means. So with that, I'd like to invite to the podium PPIC Research Associate Viet Nguyen.
Thank you, Reichen, for the warm introduction. So from the 1970s to 2006, California saw a sharp rise in the prison population. And this rise has led to overcrowding, which has created poor conditions and health issues such as inadequate medical and mental health care. In response, lawsuits were filed, and in 2009, a federal court ordered the state to reduce the prison population, which triggered several reforms. I'm going to highlight a few of the reforms that were used to reduce the state's reliance on incarceration. So in 2009, SB 678 was passed, And what it did is it created financial incentives to lower the number of individuals who violated their conditions of probation and were sent to prison. And data from the Judicial Council of California shows that the number of violations resulting in prison incarceration dropped for nearly every county from 2010 onward. In 2011, public safety realignment was passed, and it was meant to address the prison overcrowding, and it did so by shifting the responsibility of incarceration supervision for nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual offenders from the state to county sheriff and probation agencies. In addition, it required revocations to be served in county jails for a maximum of 6 months. And revocations occur when an individual violates his condition of supervision and is placed back into custody. In 2014, Proposition 47 was passed and required certain drug and property offenses to be charged as a misdemeanor as long as the individual did not have a prior serious, violent, or sexual offense. This is showing the length of stays that people served for these specified drug and property offenses. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on how realignment and Prop 47 affected probation. And so one of the major shifts is that it shifted people who traditionally would have been supervised by parole to probation. So parolees are individuals who are released from prison and supervised by the state. And with realignment, it shifts a portion of those offenders to probation. And probation, what they do is they provide community-based supervision of individuals convicted of felonies and misdemeanors. And historically, probation has been granted by county court judges as an alternative to custody in state prison or county jail. So with this shift, probation departments are now responsible for a growing share of the corrections population. So in 2015, probation supervised 390,000 individuals, and this is a little more than 60% of the corrections population. So probation plays a pretty large role in managing the criminal justice system. So how have the reforms changed probation? So we're going to focus on 3 main findings in this presentation. So first off, reforms shifted probation caseloads toward more serious offenders. Racial disparities in probation are most evident for African Americans, and jail bookings are common among the probation population, especially for realigned offenders. So to understand the impact of these reforms, we use data from the BSCC PPIC multi-county study. And the multi-county study collects individual level data for anyone who entered jail or started probation after realignment. And the data is drawn from 12 counties that represents roughly 2/3 of California's population, and they represent kind of a diverse set of demographics. So the demographics for these 12 counties are pretty similar to the state as a whole. The 12 counties represent different geographic areas, so some in Southern California, some in the Bay Area, some in the north, and they also represent different rural and urban counties as well as different population sizes. So we try to get a kind of a mix of different counties. So how did these reforms affect probation? So the main change that I did is that realignment added 2 groups of offenders to probation supervision. And that first group of offenders are the post-release community supervision, also known as PRCS. These individuals are released from prison and they're committed on nonviolent, non-serious, non-sexual offenses. And prior to realignment, these individuals would have been supervised by state parole. The second group of offenders that were added were the mandatory supervision offenders. And these individuals will serve a portion of their sentence in jail and the remainder of their sentence under supervision. And these individuals are committed on felonies that are eligible for sentencing under Penal Code 1170 subsection H. In addition, these individuals cannot have prior violent, sexual, or serious offenses. And similarly to the PRCS, these individuals would have been incarcerated in state prison and supervised by parole prior to realignment. So both these groups are composed of more serious offenders than the traditional felony and misdemeanor caseloads because they would have been under state custody and supervision prior to realignment. And we're going to follow these 2 group of offenders pretty closely for the remainder of the presentation. So with this figure here, you're going to see is it's a time trend of the new starting caseloads broken down by the 4 caseload types. And the data covered is from October 2011, which is the start of realignment, to October 2015, which is about a year after the passage of Proposition 47. And the vertical line on the right-hand side is when Prop 47 was passed. So if you look at prior to realignment, the purple line, or if you look, the purple line are the felony cases, the orange line are the new PRCS cases, the dark blue line are the misdemeanor cases, and the light blue line are the new mandatory supervision cases. So prior to Prop 47, felony probation is pretty stable, and they account for about 55 to 60% of the new cases. With the PRCS, you're going to see a kind of an initial spike within the first year of realignment, and they account for about one out of 4 new probation cases, and it kind of studies out, stabilizes to about 15 to 20% of new cases after October 2012. And the PRCS folks can come from two sources. They either are released from prison after serving a revocation or released from prison after serving court-ordered commitment. So that initial spike is driven by individuals who are released from prison after serving revocation. If you recall, one of the main changes with realignment is that it required revocations to be served in county jail for a maximum of 6 months. So after about a year, you can see that the majority of the people who are entering PRCS supervision are coming after being released after serving time for a court-ordered commitment. With the blue line, the navy blue line, the dark blue line, those are the misdemeanor cases, and they represent about 15 to 20% of the new cases. And then the mandatory supervision, they represent about 7.5% of the new cases. And you can see the growth rate for the mandatory supervision is a little bit slower before it stabilizes. That's because for these individuals, they're required to serve a portion of their time in jail before they can start their supervision. So it's a little bit of a delayed effect. And when Prop 47 hits, what it did is required certain drug and property offenses to be charged as misdemeanors. So you can see the felony and misdemeanor and mandatory supervision cases all drop. In particular, the felony and misdemeanors, they have a substantial drop in terms of new cases. And what this suggests is there's an overall reduction in the enforcement over Prop 47 offenses. And with that kind of switch in the kind of the demographics and the caseload, you can see that now the PRCS and mandatory supervision kind of account for a larger share of the new probation cases after Prop 47. Now, when we look closer to demographics, we see African Americans are overrepresented in probation. So the left-hand side, you can see this is the demographics for the county, and the right-hand side are the demographics for the probation population. And African Americans account for about 23% of the probation population, which is almost 3 times more than the county's population. Asian Americans are underrepresented. They only account for about 3% of the probation population. When we look at age and gender, the one thing that stands out is the PRCS and mandatory supervision cases on average are a little bit older than the traditional felony and misdemeanor cases. The PRCS cases are more likely to be male. So about 90% of the PRCS cases are male, as opposed to the other 3 caseloads that are 80% male. And this is because the PRCS offenders reflect the prison demographics, which is generally older and more likely to be male. So how did these changes in probation affect California jails? With the MultiCounty Study data, what we're allowed to do is we can look at the frequency in which people enter jail within a specified time window. So what this figure shows here is the percentage of people who enter jail within 1 year of starting supervision. So across the board, about 47% of people will be booked to jail at least once within the first year of supervision. And with the PRCS and mandatory supervision, you can see that they have higher rates of being booked to jail. So 51% for the PRCS and 53% for the mandatory supervision. And these higher rates suggest that the PRCS and mandatory supervision cases may be more challenging than traditional felony and misdemeanor cases. Now we can even look even more closely in terms of the frequency in which they enter jail. So what this figure shows here is the purple bar are the number of percentage of people who show up 2 or more times within a year. The orange line is the percentage of people who show up 3 or more times in a year, and the green one is 4 or more times in a year. And we can see kind of a similar trend in which the PRCS and mandatory supervision, a little bit more than a quarter of them will enter jail 2 or more times. So they kind of enter jail at a higher rate, or more frequent rate than traditional felony and misdemeanor cases. So another thing we want to really look at and examine is like, what are the type of offenses that are actually bringing these people into jail? So overall, 27.5% of those under probation supervision were booked for a felony offense on their first jail booking. And for those under mandatory supervision and felony probation, so 42% for mandatory supervision and 32.8% for felony probation were booked for a felony. For the PRCS, they have lower rates of felony bookings for their first jail booking, so only at 14.1%. But they also have higher rates of supervision violations and flash incarcerations. And flash incarceration is an intermediate sanction that allows an individual to be placed in custody for 10 days in order to deter future offending. And another thing to notice is that we're only looking at the first jail booking, so it's possible that the PRCS offenders are being booked for more serious crimes or less serious crimes after this first booking. Okay. So we also want to see what's the type of space, how many jail bed days are these individuals utilizing? And what we see is that individuals under mandatory supervision and PRCS utilize more jail days than traditional felony and misdemeanor caseloads. So the PRCS on average will spend 117 days in custody within 3 years of starting supervision. For the mandatory supervision, they spend on average 150 days within 3 years. And that mandatory supervision length is almost twice that of felonies. So these PRCS and mandatory supervision cases are utilizing more jail resources than traditional caseloads. And these jail bookings have placed pressure on the jails. So what this figure shows here is the average jail daily population, broken down by different subpopulations. So these are, the purple line are the daily population for people who are under parole supervision. The blue line is people in jail for probation supervision or under probation supervision, and the orange line is for flash incarceration. So throughout this, from October 2011 to October 2015, people under supervision account for almost about 1 in 4 people in jail. So it's a pretty substantial number. And what we see is after a year, you can see there's a switch between the parole and probation. So within a year, probation overtakes parole and accounts for a larger share of the jail population. So a little bit before Prop 47, probation accounts for about 17 to 18% of the jail population. Parole accounts for about 5 to 6% of the jail population, and flash incarceration accounts for about 1 to 2% of the jail population. With Prop 47, you can see that the probation population drops and the parole and flash incarcerations are relatively stable. And this is probably because Prop 47 offenses there are less bookings for these Prop 47 offenses, so that ADP, or average daily population, is going to drop. And these patterns point to the increasing burden of people under probation supervision on jails and decrease in the burden of parolees. So now we're going to look at the consequences and next steps. So probation departments are now managing a more challenging population. Realignment added two more types of offender, the PRCS and mandatory supervision cases. And individuals under these supervision have more jail contact than traditional felony caseloads. In addition, people under probation supervision now account for a larger share of the jail populations. And these trends in probation are part of a broader change in the correction system. County jails populations have shifted toward more serious drug and property offenders. The counties and states are now reducing their reliance on incarceration, and pretrial reform is currently being discussed. So how are counties responding to these trends? Well, the Judicial Council of California shows that probation departments across the state have expanded the use of risk assessment tools and evidence-based practices. Savings from realignment and Prop 47 have been reinvested to expand reentry opportunities. And some of the things that we've seen built over the 5 or 6 years are day reporting centers, which are meant to increase rehabilitative services. So in terms of next steps, we believe that policymakers should focus on the recidivism rates of individuals under PRCS and mandatory supervision. They should also examine the effectiveness of new tools introduced in realignment, such as split sentencing and flash incarceration. Finally, policymakers should continue to focus on the efficacy of reentry services and understand which services could be used to reduce recidivism and increase rehabilitation. And with that, I'll open up the room to Q&A.
Thanks, Viet. Are there any questions for Viet? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I was curious, seeing the comparison of the new probation. Oh, thank you. The comparison of the reentry rates for the new probation population relative to the traditional felony and misdemeanor populations. It was interesting. Were you able to look at how those rates, though, compared to pre-realignment equivalent parolee offenders?
We don't have data at the county level for the pre-realignment period in terms of probation. But you're asking about parolees and where parolees, yeah.
Sorry, probably didn't ask that very clearly. So many of these offenders would have, before realignment, been state parolees.
That's right.
And of course, they historically have had very high recidivism rates.
That's right.
And so I was curious whether under these changes, whether the recidivism rates went down for this group of offenders that otherwise would have been parolees.
That's actually a subject for a future report. But I will say that what it looks like from the work we presented here today is that under the old parole process, we used to talk about people who were churners. I don't know if you've been following parole. People were kind of just churning through the system, coming out, racking up violations, and so forth. And when they eliminated the revocation to prison as an option, the question is, where did those turners end up? And so now it looks like a lot of them are kind of churning through the jails. But we don't know if they're churning at a higher rate yet. So there's a lot of questions that we can't answer just yet. So, yeah.
Do we have data on the offenses that cause persons to be returned to custody?
Yeah, we do. So when we look more closely at the felony offenses that bring people in. Oh, sorry.
You'll have to wait until the microphone comes and then re-ask it so it's memorialized and on the tape. Thanks.
It wasn't that I wasn't heard.
That's true.
Do we have data on the offenses that resulted in people returning to custody?
Yes.
How many of them were returned because of drug offenses, personal possession? How many were returned because of armed robberies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do have detailed information on what brings someone back to custody. And for among the felony offenses, about 70% of the offenses that bring people back to jail are drug or property offenses. For the mandatory supervision, that number is even higher. About 88% of the offenses are felony drug or property offenses. And for the mandatory supervision, you can see it's more dominantly property offenses than drug offenses. But for the other PRCS, traditional felony, and misdemeanor caseloads, it's more dominated by drug offenses than property offenses.
So, and I should say that we have very granular data on what the booking offenses are. So this is just in the presentation and the report, we characterize it in terms of misdemeanor and felony. This is offense level, but we can actually break things down in lots of different ways to kind of look at specific types of offenses. And he just gave you an example of one way of doing that, yeah.
Over here.
Wait for the mic. Oh, sorry.
So I was wondering, do we have data on the results, the outcomes of the bookings, whether they resulted in convictions or is it just jail stay flat? You get the point.
Yeah, so we do have data on that. We're going to do a little bit more digging to make sure we can really characterize that accurately.
Yeah. So conviction data this is an opportunity to explain the plumbing of the system. But basically, our data come from sheriff's departments and probation departments, not from the courts. And so, to the extent that sheriff's departments actually capture accurate conviction data, then we can incorporate it. But not all do. But we also have access to DOJ conviction records. That's what we're kind of working with at the moment. So the picture, it looks better for the future in terms of nailing down exactly what the conviction outcomes are.
So under realignment, we've also increased availability of rehabilitation services, and I'm wondering if you have any data that breaks down how many of the returning or reoffenders have participated in rehabilitation services.
Sure. So a big part of the data collection ask that we've made of the counties, both of the sheriff's departments and the probation agencies, is to identify which offenders are getting what kinds of services. And the reports that we published so far, including this one, are really a prelude to work on looking at specific interventions. And so that's the data we're kind of cleaning at the moment, but the plan is to do work on recidivism, do a very deep dive on recidivism data, and then to move into looking at specific interventions. But the counties have supplied us with their data from day reporting centers, their in-custody educational programs, a wide variety of interventions that they're trying. So the goal, ultimate aim of the project is to be able to provide evidence about which of those are effective. So.
I was wondering, you mentioned that that in reoffenders coming back to prison, you're seeing more property crimes and drug possessions or drug crimes. Are you able to see if there's been a surge in sales versus possession charges since AB 109 and Prop 47 have come into place?
Yeah, so our data allows us to look into that. So that's something I could definitely dig into and break it down to you. In terms of the drug offenses, what type of actual drug offenses are bringing those people back into custody?
Jeffrey, Question, north, south, urban versus rural. Are you seeing any new trends or cycle dealing with recidivism?
Well, so the counties all exhibit some degree of variation in terms of all of the data that we presented. And we don't typically break it down by county. I don't think we're seeing anything in particular that stands out in terms of major systematic differences across the counties that are kind of worth noting at this point in the process. But that's certainly something that we're kind of interested in tracking, is that where we see, big differences, to be able to identify what the sources of those are. Thanks. Yes, Tom.
You've identified a really huge population of probationers in our state.
Yeah.
Are you also finding that somewhere around 80% of those people never actually see an agent or officer, whatever the title given, that they're in bank caseloads at 200, 300, 400 to 1?
Yeah, that's not actually documented in our data, but as we engage with the probation agencies around the state, that's a common story, which is that people are kind of on probation, but they're not being, subject to particularly intensive supervision. So, yeah.
Isn't it true that the norm term of probation in our state, the default term, is 36 months?
You would have to ask that of a legal expert. But I know that the terms can be quite long, and interestingly, when you compare the PRCS who are coming out, the mandatory supervision, who presumably have often committed more serious offenses, are under probation supervision for shorter periods of time than people who are given felony probation or misdemeanor probation, even for that matter.
And finally, as the state director of parole, I was unable to give money to counties and cities for private vendors to provide services because those folks have to go through the use permit process to gain a site to provide the services.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any change in that? I mean, I'm troubled because, as an example,
Yeah.
LA County just got ordered to give back in excess of $4 million in unused programming money.
Yeah.
And all of this rhetoric about evidence-based practices and so forth only works if there's someplace to put these folks.
Exactly. Yeah. So the logistical difficulties and challenges of actually building the promised rehabilitative infrastructure is not something that we've delved into. I mean, I would note that the Judicial Council reports are documenting kind of an increased use of various types of evidence-based practices. The counties throughout the state are using their realignment funds to build day reporting centers and to at least create those opportunities. But we don't have a piece of this research that looks at like the challenges associated with building that infrastructure, but clearly it's a huge challenge, yeah.
Along that same theme, are you, for future studies, characterizing the reentry services or rehabilitative services into particular blocks that you could talk about?
Sure, yeah. So we're looking at various types of education programs, career tech, voc ed type programs, general education programs, more specialized curriculum that are delivered through education systems like parenting and some employment training, things like that. We let the counties drive the kinds of data that they were able to provide to us. So if they can provide program level data, individual level data about which programs people are going through, we'll take and we'll see we'll connect it to recidivism outcomes. And when you look across 12 counties, you've got a lot of variety in the types of substance abuse, cognitive behavioral treatment, mental health programs. We've asked for all of that and have received. I can't say that it's systematically complete across all places. It's probably not complete in any one county that we've asked for, but there's quite a bit of richness in the data that will allow us to delve into specific types of programs. Yeah. Microphone in the front.
I'm wondering, your report said that the realigned population has higher rates of jail bookings, and I'm wondering if, based on your data, you could tell whether it was based on the fact that, for example, PRCS folks were allowed to use flash incarceration on them whereas with traditional probation population, that's not an option. So, it was either revoking or charging with a new offense.
Yeah, so with the data, we're allowed to kind of distinguish between flash incarceration violations and new offenses. And so with the PRCS, what we saw is that the majority of the people are coming in for the first time, not the majority, about 13% of them coming in for the first time are for flash incarceration, about 13% per supervision violation. So those PRCS offenders that are being brought in are it's less common for felony offenses as compared to the other three groups.
And I don't know how far your data currently goes to, but have you noticed any shift in what are the jail bookings for example, after the legislature allowed flash incarceration for mandatory supervision folks, which was not originally allowed under realignment, even though some counties were using it without authorization?
So that was 2015, right? So our data ends in 2015. So that's something that we want to incorporate when we go back to the counties to update the data, is that new change. It's a very interesting extension because you can compare people who were moving through these systems that did not have that particular option available with those that later did. And so from a research standpoint, it'd be useful for assessing whether or not flash incarceration serves the purpose that it was designed to do, which is to reduce later arrests and convictions. So we're hoping to work that in. Any other questions? Well, Viet and I will be around here if you want to chat informally with us. We thank you for coming, for your attention, and your great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.